Welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's most respected public forum. The City Club was founded in 1915 as a civic research organization. Today, its members are 2,000 men and women who share a common interest in the quality of life and government in the Portland metropolitan community. The City Club meets on Fridays at noon in downtown Portland to present speakers selected for their distinction in specialized fields, their knowledge of specific issues, and the freshness and vitality of their ideas. And now, the club's presiding officer will introduce today's speaker, Philip M. Klutznick.
Seated on your far left, Elizabeth Barnard, financial planner for Phoenix Companies, sponsored by Carlton Whitehead. Seated next to Elizabeth is Terry Chadwick, who is research and planning consultant, sponsored by Stephen Schneider. Seated at my far left, your right, is board host today, Gus Baker. Prior to introducing our speaker, I'd like to make the following announcement that next Friday we'll be featuring a discussion of private efforts to preserve endangered wildlife and natural habitat areas. Bill Blair will be speaking to us, who is the national president of the Nature Conservancy. The Conservancy is currently seeking to protect several areas in the Columbia Gorge, and the meeting will be held in this room. Finally, I almost think an introduction isn't necessary for the number of people who've walked up and said, "Hello, Mr. Klutznick, you remember me? I met you in Spokane, I met you in Seattle, I grew up with your son, I go to Chicago and you're known there." But we are fortunate to have Mr. Klutznick with us today, who is a prominent Chicago attorney and businessman, but who has devoted much of his life to the public sector, most recently as Secretary of Commerce under President Carter, and he's served in several capacities under 7 different presidents prior to that. He's served as Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations under Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, with responsibilities for development problems in third world countries. He has served many causes in the field of humanitarian and civic affairs. Under President Ford, as a member of the President's Advisory Committee on Indochinese Refugees, as a member of the National Board of the Boy Scouts of America, and as a trustee of both the Eleanor Roosevelt Institute and the Adlai Stevenson Institute for International Affairs. He's long been prominent in the Jewish community as president of the World Jewish Council, as chairman of the Institute of Jewish Policy Planning, and was the honorary international president of B'nai B'rith. He was a governor and senior director of the United Nations Association, a member of the Senior Council and Advisory Committee of the Chicago Association of Commerce and Industry. He served on the boards of Creighton University, Roosevelt University, and on the advisory committee of the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. He served as a member of the board of directors of the Continental Foreign Trade Bank of Geneva, the First Mark Corporation, the Mortgage Guarantee Insurance Corporation, and of course the Urban Investment and Development Company, which he founded and headed. I think Mr. Klutznick has exemplified the qualities in both his personal and his public life, which we find desirous of all occupants of the Wayne Morse Chair on Law and Politics: courage, intelligence, integrity, industry and independence, scholarship and teaching ability, statesmanship and contributions to world peace, representative government, and the rule of law. All qualities we have long associated with Wayne Morse himself. The Wayne Morse Chair is not only a memorial to a brilliant, far-sighted public servant, it's also a living institution through which the vital force that was the man himself can be perpetuated, and as the chair likes to say, the renewal of our society can be fostered. The nation needs more such great morally independent servants, and the chair is a means by which we can develop those people. Part of that development is the responsibility of the private entrepreneur to thoroughly understand public affairs and those areas in the national interest which must have cooperative relationships rather than those that are adversarial. And it is this last point which Mr. Klutznick will be addressing us today. It's my deep pleasure to introduce Philip Klutznick.
thank you for a more than generous introduction. As an old friend of mine said many years ago, when he was much younger, when he was introduced so elaborately, he said, "I can hardly wait to hear myself talk." I wish my wife were here. Unfortunately, she was detained, and she might have forgiven me for all the inconvenience I've caused her these 51 years. Let me start out first with acknowledging the subject that I'm addressing as being far more consequential than the time and circumstances permits me to develop. And I think it's important and consequential because we who live through life tend to forget how much life changes. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who went back to his college reunion, 15 years of his graduating class. He was a dentist. He went back to school and he went to see his favorite professor, and he wasn't in the room. So he mulled around his desk and he took a look at the examinations, the final examinations. And when the professor came in, he said, "Doctor, I don't understand one thing. These questions are identical to the questions you gave us 15 years ago." And the wise old man turned to him and says, "Elmer, it's the answers that are different." And that indeed we tend to forget. And sometimes we fail to pass the examination as a result. You know, they said of famous poet Robert Frost, who had that great distinction of reading that remarkable poem at the John F. Kennedy inauguration, that the one thing he hated to do when he was teaching was to give an examination. And finally, he was called in by the president, and he said, "Look, Mr. Frost, we honor you. We think you're a great man, but the regulations of the school require that you give a final examination. Now, you've been ducking it for years. You can't get by with it anymore." And the old gentleman looked him in the eye, and he said, "Well, if I have to, I will." Pardon? You can't hear me? Can you now? Yeah, but it's getting too loud for me. Just go right. I'll try to remember that, but if you've been to the well about 40 times in 5 days, it gets to a point where the voice sounds very loud, even when you whisper. But Robert Frost said, "If I have to give an examination, I will." And he growled about it and went back to his class, and he gave him an examination. He asked him what question? One question. And the question was, "What did you learn in this course that you took?" And he got the papers back and he graded them, and later on he was walking on the campus along with another fellow professor, and he told him how he'd given this examination. And he said, "Well, how did it work?" "Well," he said, "it's all right. I graded them all A except one." He said, "Which one was that?" "Well," he said, "you know, the fellow that answered, I didn't learn a damn thing." So his colleague said, "Were you offended?" He said, "No, but he misspelled damn." I guess we all get examined one way or another, and I'm going through an examination that I'm enjoying more than any I've taken in many years. Reference has been made to the Wayne Morse chair and the function of the person who occupies it. Well, I came on here from a few days at the Harvard Kennedy School. I mentioned that not for distinction, but for comparison. And I had a class of fellows. These fellows were people who had served in government and were taking leave long enough for a refresher course. Very bright, very able, very searching kind of people, and very sophisticated. The other morning I had a class at Eugene of freshmen and sophomores in political science discussing one of the crisis areas, the third world, and as bright and informed and sophisticated as were the Kennedy Fellows, these people, I must tell you, were just as alert, in many ways consider the age of their development just as bright, but more importantly, they asked the right questions. We sometimes reach a point of sophistication in life where we think that we know so much that we live above the realities of the world in which we live. It's only when you get a group of 100+ young people like this on the threshold of life that you sometimes get the real questions, because they're thinking of the future where many of us are still living in the past. And it was one of the most exciting hour and a half that I've had in a long while, since my youngest grandchild told me when I came back from Washington, "Grandpa," this is at age 4, "you're getting too old, and you don't understand me." So I thought that the subject here today ought to be what I've considered one of the most important failures in recent years in our society. And that's the true understanding of how much better we are as a people than we give ourselves credit for, and how we fail to appreciate how our private behavior is the wonder of the rest of the world, whereas our discharge of public responsibilities is the disdain of a good part of the world. Let me cite an immediate example that disturbs me beyond repair. I've been in France a number of times. I know the divisions in France politically and how serious they are. And in spite of that, they just finished the first round of an election. And bad weather, which reduced the number that went to the polls. A lousy election, because people were pretty much turned off by everybody, except the fellow that they weren't going to elect or nominate. And yet, 80% of the French people who were eligible to vote, voted. I sit home these nights and I hear people as old as I am, which is ancient, and as young as some of you, get up on television and on radio and write in the papers. We must recognize the mandate of the people of America, and we must support the president. Now let me tell you something. I support whoever is president. But I don't support the nonsense that 50% of the American people who are eligible to vote, who elect a president by 1 or 1.5%, have sent forth a mandate. I want that clear. And it's a disgrace of American life that the most precious right that we have, we fail to exercise because it's a little inconvenient or it isn't Sunday when we can go there. And I tell you, that kind of discharge of private obligation does not at all compare with other pictures of the American public. For example, when Alex de Tocqueville came here, when the country was organized, he wrote a report in which he said that these Americans are an unusual people. They don't wait for their kings or their presidents to tell them what to do. If they believe in something, they get together, organize, and proceed to do it. A few years ago, there was a report authorized by a group of us who got together, later became known as a Filer Commission. John Filer, the chairman of the board of Aetna, was the chairman. The late John D. Rockefeller was really the godfather. He wanted a study made of private philanthropy and public needs. We spent several years on that study, and we concluded probably the best documented study that's ever been made in that area. And the studies that preceded the conclusions are probably more important than the conclusions, and they're to be found in the libraries around America. What did we discover? We discovered that we are probably the most generous nation in the world in voluntary giving. In the last year of the University of Michigan analysis, $29 billion had been contributed to philanthropic causes of one kind or another. More significantly, the study also analyzed the amount of free voluntary time that was given. And almost as if it was foreordained in heaven, the figure we came up with at the minimum wage rate was approximately the same as the dollars that were given, $29 billion. Now that to the rest of the world is a phenomenon of outstanding importance. You will not find another country that has generated that kind of voluntary behavior and yet neglected its public responsibilities to the degree that we neglect them in the discharge of the right of franchise. That's why an institution like the Kennedy School of Government and a chair like the Wayne Morse chair becomes so important. It becomes important to grab people when they're young enough who will understand the difference between a mandate in public life and the necessities of taking action in public life, who will understand that their duty is to vote even when they disagree and know they're going to be defeated. And that's why Wayne Morse means something to me, because he took a position on principle even if you disagreed with him. And you can't have democracy and you can't have a free society unless you have a certain number of Wayne Morses around all the time who know enough about the subject not to be misled by the newspaper headlines, who know enough about the subject so that they take a position on fact and on principle. Unless we develop young people who have the courage to do and act in this fashion, the decline which many outside of this country think we've entered into could become a reality. There is a book published by a man who studied Japan for 20 years. I've referred to it a half a dozen times. If you haven't read it, read it. Japan is Number One by Professor Vogel. Learn how it became number one from nothing. It's only 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that they produced 200,000 automobiles. No more, some less. And today we're begging them to cut off 125,000. As if that's going to solve our problem of failure in technical advance and in production. I can't think of anything so ridiculous as to assume that those kind of actions, reducing from 1,700,000 to 1,600,000, will induce General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, Volkswagen here, American Motors, to improve their technology. We can't wait until accidents take place. We've got to anticipate them. We have to have people who are alert to what's happening in the world and have the curiosity of these freshmen and sophomores rather than the sophistication of the fellows. If you read Vogel's Japan is Number One, you'll find that one of his greatest claims for that reason is that they have more information, they get around the world more, they try to understand what's happening, they accept what's happening elsewhere, and they're not ashamed to use what happened elsewhere and improve on it. I think for too long a period of time, we've accepted the notion that what we do is right all the time. We haven't had the curiosity because of our great success, an enormous success, and as a result, others who've had it have either excelled us in some respects, equaled us, or approximated us. Now, the simple question is, does it have to be so? I think not. In spite of all the internal criticisms and an unfortunate election where we spent too much time talking about things that weren't so, which is true of all lengthy elections, we're still the richest country in the world. This year will be a $3 trillion gross national product year. We have the most productive territory in the world. A Japan that supplies us automobiles can't eat unless we supply 30% of their food. The danger is that we'll become the agricultural country of the world while everybody else becomes the industrial country. That's the danger. We're a country that of 227 million people, and a country, in spite of all that one may say about it, has the most potentially productive people in the world, education-wise and otherwise. All that we need to do is to discharge our private responsibilities in the public sector with the kind of intelligence and the kind of application that the seriousness of the future of America demands. I know that I've talked about small things instead of great things. It's the small things that we don't know enough about. And as a consequence, we make decisions based upon misinformation. Let me conclude with one of my favorite allusions. Understand there's a question period. I hope it also becomes a debating period. But In my experience in government, and it's one of the attributes of our society that more than many, we try to induce people from the private sector to accept posts. One of my disappointments is that some of my colleagues find it inconvenient or uncomfortable, or maybe they don't want to go through the rigorous examination of their past. I don't know what it is that is demanded by our government. But the greatest thrills of my life have been obtained in working in the government, not outside of it. And the potential for excitement and perfecting your own understanding of life is greater. There are very few countries which will accept people in the diplomatic service who haven't been trained for it. The United States does. And as a matter of principle, accepts a certain number of them because it kind of shakes up what is otherwise a striped pants fraternity. You can get an opportunity to work in government at lower height posts and help perfect your own life by a better appreciation of what it means to live in a society like ours. They tell the story, you know, about Michelangelo, who was working on one of his minor works. A friend called on him, didn't want to disturb him. He watched him very carefully. And he said to him, well, I'll come back and see you in a few weeks. He came back to see him in a few weeks. He looked at the work, and he says, what have you been doing? There's been no change, nothing but trifles. And Michelangelo answered him, it's true. I've been working on trifles. Trifles make for perfection, and perfection is no trifle. My friends, that's what the test is today. Not to be carried away by a debate on a budget. Nobody understands it, including the people who are debating it. I've lived with this federal budget for so many years that I respect Professor Nordhaus when he says, of Yale, when he says, I can prove, just a few weeks ago, that we're really $100 billion in surplus. I think he can. I honestly think he can. I can also prove that we're $100 billion in deficit, because the number of figures that are involved in that budget, I'm satisfied no president has ever read. And a lot of secretaries of commerce haven't read it either. The budget is a document that we ought to get behind us, and I hope, I support the president if he thinks that faith and hope and charity is needed in the budget. Let's give it to him. And let's get on to the trifles, not the big figures. How do we improve productivity? How do we generate more interest in innovation? How do we get the pipeline filled with young people who want to be engineers and researchers instead of, forgive me, lawyers and MBAs and something else? We need new ideas. We need technology. We need the energy of those people who want to make that their life's work. And that, to me, while it's small in perspective and is a trifle, when we perfect it, it will be perfection. I thank you very much.
As is the City Club custom, Mr. Klutznick has agreed to answer our questions. Chris is now bringing the mic forward for members of the audience to ask their questions. Please use the mic if at all possible so that our radio audience can hear you. As soon as she brings it forward, we'll entertain the first question.
I didn't agree to answer all questions. I agreed to receive them. and try to answer them. Yes. Yes, you want to take that mic, and you're second. You're not talking loud enough.
Well, I take it then that the great criticisms which the electorate has had over the past few years regarding bureaucracies and people in government, then perhaps has had an opposite effect upon the welfare and the good functioning of government. Would you agree or disagree?
The criticism of what?
Towards bureaucracy in government.
Has done what?
The criticism of bureaucracy in government as a means of deprecating government in general has had a deleterious effect on the welfare of government.
Well, I don't quite understand the contradiction in terms. I have never used the word bureaucracy too freely because I've worked in big business too. And I think you can identify bureaucracy as being an aspect of bigness rather than being peculiarly limited to the government. I think the bureaucracy ought to be criticized, whether in business or in government, if the criticism is apt and applicable. I think it's good to be criticized. I just had an interview in which I was asked some questions with respect to fisheries, which was in the Department of Commerce. We were badly criticized for a deficit in fish, of all things. We have a 200-mile zone around oceans, and we did have a deficit. That criticism provoked action, constructive action. So, as far as I'm concerned, in a free country, I start from the premise that anyone who serves in government, or for that matter, in business that has an effective role in the society, is appropriately a subject of constructive criticism, preferably, or any other kind if someone wants to evoke it. I think that will improve the welfare of the country if we don't try to stymie people from talking. I do believe in freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. But I don't know what your conclusion means under those circumstances. I can think only one good that can come from it, and that is to flush out the bureaucracy of big business or big government from those who are not doing their job, and hopefully substituting the kind of people that will do. And that's why I favor a Wayne Morse chair, in the hope we can create some youngsters who will have stars in their eyes and do the kind of job that will quit people calling the government a bureaucracy and calling big business free enterprise. Pardon me.
Okay, thank you. Next, I'd like to disagree somewhat. You said we need innovation and new ideas. I think perhaps the problem is not so much that we do not have new ideas and innovation, but the structure does not recognize them, it does not use them. And I give as one example several innovative ideas that were proposed to the electronics industry and the automobile industry of this country were turned down flat, and then those individuals took them elsewhere to be used in Japan, for example, to strengthen their industry. How do we get the industrial leaders and the government leaders to recognize what we already have and could put into use?
I'm glad you said what you did. When I said innovation and productivity and technology, I included, and I want to amplify my statement, the use of what we've got, because you're completely right. We have a tremendous abundance of technology that hasn't been used. As a matter of fact, Japan is using and has used much of the technology that originated here. It merely used it and found methods of using it that we didn't even take the trouble to find. We talk about the production of automobiles in Japan, and much is contributed to The robot. Well, the robot was born here. They merely adopted it and did better with it. We didn't do anything about it until we saw what they did. So I include and accept your amplification. I'll go beyond that. We have 600 to 700 federal laboratories around the world engaged in research of every kind. We have one of the finest research laboratories in an institution called the National Bureau of Standards, 45 miles from Washington. I dare say, not more than a parcel, a very small parcel, of industrialists have ever visited these places. And what's more, very few of the bureaucracy have visited these places. I was at the Boulder Laboratory, Department of Commerce run, 7 or 8 months ago. Some of the best scientists on weather, on air controls, on laser beams, on time, that you'll find in the world operating in that laboratory. I visited with them around the table and coffee, and we talked after they'd shown me what they were doing. And I turned to the second in command, a fine scientist, and I said to him, if you had one thing that you would ask the Secretary of Commerce to do, what would it be? Well, he said, you've given me an opportunity, and I wish you won't misunderstand me. I would hope that you would get some key industrial figures to come and visit us and understand what we're doing here. In my 22 years here, I have had not one such visit. Now, all I am saying is that you're right in your assumption, but even if we do that, we will miss on some things. But what has happened is that there's been a tendency to create a notion of separatism between government process and private enterprise and labor. And if I had one wish that I could fulfill, it would be that we'd cut out this nonsense of adversary relationships, preserving the tension that properly belongs, so that we could learn from each other what we're doing and help one another, rather than to stand on the sidelines and criticize one another as if I'm always right and you're always wrong, and vice versa, which is utter nonsense. No one is always right and no one is always wrong. And this, I think, is the spirit that we need to develop, and I hope the pragmatic attitude of President Reagan will stimulate that kind of view.
As the perceived or the actual role of government contracts in the near future, what is or could you comment on the mechanism that might be effective in seeing that public needs rather than private needs are served as private resources begin to step in and fill some of the voids that government has in the past been involved in?
Well, I stand here and hope and pray that the words that you've uttered as an assumption will become realized. Because if we don't, there'll have to be tremendous changes in the present perspective. Every time I have known a president, from President Roosevelt on, from whom I worked first, who has promised to contract government, we always ended up, and balance the budget, we always ended up with a greater imbalance in the budget and a larger government. If the miracle has now taken place, where we'll find a device by which to eliminate not the essential functions of government, but waste in government, which takes place incidentally at state and city level just as it does in federal, then there's a hope that we will not increase the size of our government. There's very little hope, my friend, that over the years we're going to be able to avoid taking on the responsibilities for an ever-increasing population and an ever-increasing role in the world. We're now 227 million people. We're a much greater nation in terms of numbers than we were at the end of World War II, give alone the Roosevelt days. And even though we employed 97 million people today, when we thought 60 million was silly, we still have 7.5% unemployed. We've got problems that miracles won't solve, nor faith or hope or charity. I don't like to see charity solving those problems. And I don't accept the function that in America, that justice is not an entitlement of everybody who lives in this country as a citizen. Justice. And the word entitlement that I use is not the definition that Mr. Stockman uses. We have become great because we have respect for every individual who's a member of this country. We can only stay great as a nation if we continue to have it. Let me conclude with one other assumption that is inaccurate because of what it implies. I work in private philanthropy, and I work in institutions like the Committee for Economic Development. The very report to which I alluded, the Filer Commission report, criticized the failure of the corporate community to make the maximum contribution that they could under existing tax laws, which is 5% of earnings, as a result of which there's been a substantial increase. A substantial increase. Now let me add one other evidence where the public sector served to increase private investment. And I know this is going to be unpopular with some, but the National Endowment of the Arts and the Endowment for Humanities, which in terms of a $700 billion budget is very little, but which is proposed for a substantial cut on the theory that if we cut, the private sector will pull up that cut, or make it, which is implied in what you said. The fact is that when the National Foundation for the Arts started, the contribution of the private sector to the arts was something like 20% of what it is today. The fact that there was seed money put into the arts. Now you may consider art unimportant. I don't. I think without art and without humanity, you don't have an American culture. But today, it's around $500 or $600 million. Now, I don't know how you induce private contribution, except challenge grants have become American. Now, if we can get challenge grants that make up the rest of it, fine. I can only say one thing to you. What I have seen across the country suggests to me that America is beginning to rebuild its culture and strengthen it as a result of the activities of the last 10 or 15 years. Let me go one step beyond that. It's economic suicide not to continue to stimulate the arts. I was a keynote speaker at a conference of businessmen and government people last fall on that very question, the economic significance of the arts. Now, I come from a business development community. And I remember when I built my first town, that the people who came back from the war weren't prepared to do without cultural commitment. And we had to build a moving picture theater when everybody said we were wasting our money, so they'd have an assembly place where there could be lectures and things of that sort. I remember, too, when book selling was really a kind of a downtown business. Today, in almost every town there's a bookstore of some kind of any significance, stimulated by the desire to read. And the business that the Foundation for Hearts and Humanity stimulated, I asked for a calculation on what it amounted to last year. It was over $6 billion. Now, so there's an economic aspect of some of this activity, as well as a very important cultural aspect. And I think it's important we look into these things across the board to be sure that the decisions we're making are right. Yes, sir.
Charles Sykes, City Club. I have a quick question for you, Mr. Speaker, but first I think this club should recognize the presence of a longtime friend of mine from Eugene who accompanied you, who has made a tremendous contribution to arts in Oregon. Hope Pressman, it may not be known to many of you, but she's helped your life to be better in this state. Would you mind standing up, Hope, and be recognized?
She's helped my life be better too this last week.
I knew that. I wonder whether we as a nation can continue our ever-accelerating consumption of the world's material resources to continue the increasing of our standard of living, using more metals, more resources of every kind, and not face retribution from the emerging third world envy of this position, and not have a worldwide reaction that will force us to lower our expectations.
Well, there is always the danger that what we consider to be infinite is really finite. But I don't think we're anywhere near that conclusion, because we have only begun the exploration of areas that I hope haven't been closed off by a recent abandonment of the proposed treaty for the utilization of the bed of the sea, where all the indications of the preliminary studies of the Department of Commerce suggest that there's an abundance potential of metals that are considered to be in critical supply, for example. But the issue you propound is quite real. If you read Toffler, of course, he says it won't be very long until we're mining the bed of the sea and we're building up in the sky, which may be true, it may not be true. But our ability to reuse waste may be the greatest source to fill that need. One of the great tragedies of some of our lack of technology that can be improved is that in the manufacturing process we're throwing away metals and plastics because we are not shaping our forms closely enough, or as a result increasing the price. Now that's one aspect of the problem you propounded. There's another aspect that's far more serious, and here I must join you 100%, but maybe from the back door instead of the front door. In 1961 on, until about the end of that century, the United States was the #1 leader in the whole world in projecting cooperation with the third world in order to improve the standards of living and their ability to support themselves. From then on, through Republican and Democratic administrations as well, we dropped to about 10th or 11th in what is the North-South confrontation. I consider the North-South confrontation one of the most serious aspects of our international life today. Our neglect in applying ourselves to finding a solution to the elevation by their own strength of the standards of living of a good part of the world, can do precisely what you said. If China, from where I came only a few months ago, has to continue to cut back because it has a reputation of honor in paying its debts, and 1 billion people go at the present standard of living, either their political system, which is supporting many of the things we believe in today, will rot, or we will have the kind of desperation that may well achieve what you're talking about. So what you have raised is one of the key questions in my view of the next 10 years. We have done some good. Some of our greatest competitors today come from the third world. Korea, Taiwan, tomorrow Mexico, and a few others, Brazil. But we have not given the attention and thought to how 6% of the world's population can use up 25% of the world's gross product and stand idly by in a world that is now an open book, where communication is instantaneous, without ultimately suffering reverses that could be of tragic dimensions. I happen to be of the school, however, that believes that the evil decree can be averted if we start working with these people, as we hoped to do when we launched the first development decade in 1961. You, sir?
We have time for one quick question and one quick answer.
All right. I'm Ray Polanyi.
Yes, question, don't.
Ray Polanyi, member of the City Club. My question is this. Are you comfortable with this mandated administration indication that it intends to cut government outlays every place except military?
Well, comfort is a word that I don't quite. Personally, I sleep nights. My grandchildren are a lot of joy. I have all the food I want and a little extra to give away. What I think we're saying is Howard Baker right when he said, let's get this budget passed. We know it's a gamble, but we've got to take it. I'm inclined to think that the atmosphere in the country as I travel around suggests that someone wants to laugh with laughter. And if they want to try it, this is a democracy. Some of us will get hurt in the process if it's wrong. If it's patently wrong, I have confidence in the President and the Congress that they will change it. There is one rule of political life I've learned, and I espouse it for your consideration. Even though a man may be 70 and becomes president, he hasn't said since he became president that he won't stand for re-election. He only said it before. And there are congressmen who stand for re-election. And in my judgment, survival is the first rule of political life. And if the circumstances demand it, I'm convinced that Ronald Reagan, being pragmatic, will come before the people and make just as stirring a speech as he made the other night. And it was stirring for a man who had just recovered. And he will convince us that we tried it and it's wrong. And it will change. And that's what I hope for, and I live with it, if it becomes necessary. But I conclude with one thought. If, in fact, the novel theology of supply economics, which is mathematically inaccurate, works, then I'll applaud it. Thank you very much.
Before we officially adjourn, I do want to remind you that next week we'll have Bill Blair with us speaking about preservation of wildlife and some natural habitat areas along the Columbia Gorge. With that, thank you for coming, and have a good week.
City Club meetings are videotaped on Fridays by Liberty Cable Television Incorporated and can be seen regularly on the following Monday at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. over this cable channel. This program is intended for the private use of our viewing audience and may not be used otherwise without the expressed and written permission of the City Club of Portland.